You'll see that this morning, because it is Aloha Sunday, I chose a proverb, a native Hawaiian proverb, which says, "Break off the tip of your spear." And this proverb is quite a remarkable one and really quite profound when you consider its implications, because the ancient Hawaiian peoples knew, as we ought to know ourselves, that prolonged combat or conflict just perpetuates misery. It can lead to endless blood feuding among various tribes and individuals, families. So they said there's a time to break the tip off your spear. There's a time to adopt another way of resolving your conflicts, your confrontations with those around you. And what is this other way? Well, I'll tell you. When I was in graduate school many years ago, I had an Indian friend, not a Native American, but a real Indian from India. He had abandoned his own religious interests. He was probably Hindu, I don't know. But he had come to America and adopted Christianity. Now, he freely said that he didn't believe in all of Christianity. He didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus. He saw Jesus as fundamentally one of us, which is pretty much what unity says. There's the same divinity in us all, and Jesus happened to discover it, and he happened to allow it to flourish. But anyway, my Indian friend said to me one day, "I agree with most of what Jesus says, but I wish he hadn't said a couple of things. Notably, what's written in Matthew 5:39, 38 and 39. So let me read you what my good Indian friend objected to. These are Jesus' words. "You have heard that it was said," in the book of Exodus, as a matter of fact, "an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also." This is the classic exposition which Jesus utters elsewhere of non-resistance. Now, Jesus knew very well from his own scriptures, he's just quoted the book of Exodus, that the Jewish law was more draconian in many ways than the Sharia law that we condemn among the extreme Islamists. It talks about eyes and tooths, teeth, and cutting off hands. Read it, it's there. And yet Jesus says, in the presence of his fellow religionists, he says, "Aha, there's another way." Jesus was not a wimp, whatever that is. He's a strong man. He's an artisan. He's tough. He's streetwise. And yet he chooses to expound and to advocate this other way. He lives in a violent society, a society so violent that it's Taliban plus 10. There's religious strife. There's racial tension and strife. And then, of course, you have the Romans, bless their hearts. As an occupying power, wow, you don't upset them. They have no compunction in crucifying 20,000 people at a time. So, what's Jesus up to? As my Scottish friends would say, is he a little bit tetched? Has the sun gotten to him? Why is he saying this? Because he sees there is this different way, this way of non-resistance. And let me make a distinction here because I think it's very important. Many of us are familiar with the notion of passive resistance. We think of the example of Mahatma Gandhi, for example. The Mahatma, the teacher. Gandhi, who freed India from the rule of the British. He saw clearly this distinction. And he made it entirely plain. He said, non-resistance is, in his language, satyagraha, which means effectively soul force. It is within the command of the individual to exercise soul force, to practice non-resistance. But he realized that as the leader of millions of Indians, he could not impose such a regime upon the individual. Instead, he practiced a form of passivity that in many instances was extremely active in terms of resistance. It's called passive resistance. He, for example, would have 10,000 of his followers lie down on a railroad track in front of a British locomotive. He knew that the British were governed by law. He knew, because he was an attorney who'd been trained in London, he knew darned well that they would not drive the locomotive over those people lying in its path. They wouldn't do it because it was against the law. Of course they wouldn't. In other regimes, the locomotive would have gone forth and the limbs would have been scattered everywhere. But the British wouldn't do that. I'm not saying the British are great folk, but, they do have their limits. Bless their hearts. And I hold one of their passports, so I have to be careful. But I'll come to that later. But that's passive resistance. It's a form of resistance. Gandhi realized, as I believe Jesus realized, as I believe Martin Luther King realized, that passive resistance is one thing, highly effective in getting governments to change their minds, in bringing regimes down even. But non-resistance centers around a personal, moral, spiritual decision that only the individual can make. It's hugely personal, and far from being cowardly, pusillanimous, if you want a long word for a coward, far from being pusillanimous, it is brave. It is brave. It's remarkably brave. Jesus knew this, and Jesus practiced non-resistance throughout his brief career, even in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he could have resisted and could have initiated a revolt against the Roman occupying forces, based perhaps on passive resistance, refusing to pay their taxes, lying down in front of their chariots. He chose not to because he realized that his spiritual path, his spiritual integrity, his spiritual worth, his spiritual understanding, his spiritual growth, all of these things were based upon an individual decision not to resist. And he didn't. He may have said in the garden, "Take this cup from me." But he stayed there and passed through what was inevitable without resistance. Is there greater bravery than that? I don't know. I know that as I've grown older, I've more and more looked at this non-resistance option, and I've become more and more willing to see it as part of my repertoire in dealing with life. We have many strategies, do we not, for dealing with life. We can fight back. Damn it, we'll fight back. Somebody comes at me physically, verbally, whatever, and they start attacking. I'm going to get that spear and make sure it has a tip on it. And my God, I'm going to thrust it at him. Because I'm a scrappy little so-and-so when it comes out. I always was. Suppose I'm a Sagittarian, probably. That's what my wife says. Anyway, as I have grown older, and you will say, the cynics among you, as you have grown weaker, a cruel slice. No. As I have grown older, I have seen more and more the tremendous advantage of non-resistance, and seen it not as a fearful response, but as a response of huge spiritual and moral strength. Not to give me a sense of satisfaction, not to enable me to say, well, vengeance is yours, saith the Lord. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. No, that's not what I'm thinking. I'm thinking this is a personal decision. Do I attack in response to a challenge, or do I just say, I'm not going to accept this. I don't want to take this on as part of my emotional and spiritual life. I don't want to see this as part of my being. I don't want to do this. I don't want to fight back. Now, I've had quite a confrontational life, believe it or not. I ran for Parliament at one time. Do you know that? Because I have two passports. I have a British and American passport, and I thought back in 1981 it might be a fun idea to run for the British Parliament, for the House of Commons. I saw myself there in Churchillian style, in the traditional oratorical stance. Well, I thought this is a great idea. Did you know, by the way, and incidentally, that the first woman in the House of Commons was an American? Nancy Astor. She was the first woman. Now, there was an earlier woman who was elected to the House of Commons. Her name was Countess Markiewicz. She was an Irish patriot who had married a Polish count, and she won a seat because at that time, before the First World War, Britain governed Ireland, and she won a seat to the House of Commons. She never took it in protest. So the first woman actually to sit in the House of Commons was Nancy Astor. And she was a thorn in the flesh of every government, her own party included, for about 20 years. Remarkable woman. Anyway, I thought I would run for Parliament. I was doing pretty well. But initially, and I'll tell you why I didn't win, at least why I think I didn't win, I was doing pretty well until the monstrous woman Thatcher invaded the Falkland Islands. Then there was a surge of late colonialist, imperialist patriotism, fueled, I fear, by our President Reagan. And Mrs. Thatcher, of course, won the next election in a landslide, and I was left dangling. I did very badly. But what I discovered, and it was a big lesson for me, what I discovered when I ran that campaign was that when I addressed a group, half of them hated me and half of them loved me. And I used to get the most appalling letters from, English politics, British politics if you want, English politics are very vigorous and confrontational. Maybe you've seen Prime Minister's Question Time on the public channel. It happens in Canada too because they have the same system. There's a lot of personal insult traded back and forth. And I had the most appalling interruptions in my talks, in my campaign discussions. I had letters that you wouldn't believe. It was horrible. And I had to think, well, will I fight back or not? And I chose at that time very, very decisively, and I remember the psychological state in which I found myself at that time, and I said, no, for the first time really in my life, I'm going to practice some non-resistance. And so I just let it wash over me. I didn't win because of a Thatcher woman, but that's all beside the point. Had I done so, I might have changed my stance to a more aggressive one. I don't know. But I am no stranger to aggression and response. Heavens, I walk for an hour and a half every evening out on Waikiki Beach and round the park and the zoo. And I've been threatened a couple of times. And what I've done, it's late at night, what I've done is just pretty much raise my hands in the token of universal surrender. Most of those who have confronted me have obviously had a few pints of something, but I just raise my hand and they're baffled. They're sort of angry. They want confrontation. They're angry. They want somebody to fight back, but I'm not going to do it. I haven't been knocked down yet. I can't tell you for a moment, because it would be hypocritical for me to do so, that I practice non-resistance as a universal response to threat. I don't. Prick me, press my buttons, and you may very well get an irate response. Bingo! I have my spear, and there is a tip on it. But I've come more and more and more, as I've grown older, to appreciate the wisdom of that master teacher. When we don't respond in anger, when we don't retaliate, when instead we move back, just let events transpire, amazing things happen. Aggression seems to evaporate in many instances, not because we are afraid of confrontation or because our opponents believe necessarily that we are fearful. Something seems to happen. And the older I get, and probably the weaker I get, for heaven's sake, let's be honest, the less interested I am in the aggressive response. I am more concerned with non-resistance. Never mind passive resistance. My days of lying down in front of trains are gone. For one thing, I probably couldn't get up in time when the train... And I'm not going to try that this morning. Non-resistance has proven of great benefit to me because it has allowed me to place in perspective those threats that have come toward me. And it has enabled me to realize that I don't need to let them into my consciousness. Why should they disturb the calm peace of my soul? Why should they invade the peace that I'm searching for and trying to establish? That's not to say, as I've just finished remarking, that I will not stand up for my rights if I'm threatened. I will. But more and more, increasingly, I am looking at this other way, the way that Jesus advocated. And while many years ago I would have said with Nietzsche, the German philosopher, this is a weak morality, I am saying this is a strong morality. The person who chooses not to resist is in a position of extraordinary strength. Moral strength, spiritual strength, because they really have command of the situation when you sit down and think about it. So it's an element in the repertoire of responses we have to life. Should we use it on all occasions? I don't know. I don't. But it's there as a choice, as a possibility. And I think so often, it does work. Sit down, yes.